So this one was really, I have to say, unsurprising when you think about it objectively, but extremely frustrating when you're watching it happen firsthand. The idea that a landlord could kill a deal, and yet we just saw this take place, where you have a deal, the buyer and the seller come to an agreement, they write up a contract, agree on purchase price, agree on terms. Buyer goes to the lender, gets the lender to commit to the deal, gives the buyer a commitment letter. And then at that point, and you'll see in these kinds of contracts, if the seller of the business is a different person or entity than is the landlord from whom owns the property that the business operates out of, at that point, there's a period where the buyer gets to go to the landlord and say, hey, Mr. Landlord, or hey, Mrs. Landlord, I'm going to be the new operator in this building, assuming we come to a lease agreement. I see you already have an agreement with the existing operator. Hopefully we can have something pretty similar come here and let's get this, excuse me, let's get this done. And again, we just saw a deal here where the landlord was asking for ridiculous items, 40% increase of the rent rate, 40%. But that actually, look, in theory, you could still get the deal done if you have enough optimism in the business and if you think the property's worth it and all of that. They refused, the landlord for this deal that I'm talking about here, they quantifiably refused to sign the lender waiver agreement that essentially just says that the lender gets the first lien rights to the collateral inside the premises of the property, a la the furniture, the fixtures, not fixtures like toilets, but I'm talking about the other, I guess fixtures are really actually the wrong thing to say, but most pointedly, furniture that the buyer brings, equipment that the buyer uses to operate their business, and the other goods like inventory within the building. The landlord wanted and basically refused to give up the first lien rights to those assets, despite the fact that they were also requiring the first month rent, the last month rent, a personal guarantee. I mean, in this scenario, you're dealing with a landlord that was damn near practicing Nazism. I mean, just way over the top, in my opinion, as far as the request. But in this scenario, the landlord literally killed the deal. This is actually the deal for some of you who follow my girlfriend, Angela, her YouTube channel. I mean, she had the commitment letter. Everything was ready to go. And yet the landlord killed the deal because they refused to sign that lender waiver that essentially subordinated the landlord below the lender, simply for the collateralization of, again, stuff like furniture and equipment, right? I mean, it's out of your mind. It's the kind of request that I had never even heard of. Never even heard of it. Even if you were, let's, for example, say that in theory, she was willing to say, do you know what, screw it, let's do it for the 40% increase. It still couldn't have gotten done because they refused to subordinate their position for the collateral inside the property to the lender. Even if you accepted that. And I mean, this was a toothy agreement. You can imagine with the things we're discussing here, this was not drafted up by the brother-in-law who was an art student. This was drafted up by a lawyer, clearly. But again, even if she had agreed to the 40% increase in rent, which of course was not something she was keen on, it wasn't even a discussion point. It wasn't even open to negotiation. They categorically and repeatedly refused to sign the lender waiver agreement after prior saying that they would. I guess the real case in point here in my mind is as follows. One, it's so much nicer and easier to do a deal wherein the seller of the business also owns the property and can sell that property to you. With B&B, our business and now somewhat of a conglomerate in Tampa Bay, we own the property from which we operate out of. And it gives us tremendous amounts of flexibility and freedom. We get to choose what we do with the grounds. We've actually repurposed some of the grounds. We've made it into our own, and we don't have to check in with anyone or ask anyone for permission. And in a scenario where you're trying to buy a company, it for one, having the landlord be the seller who's selling the business allows you to negotiate much more competitively because the seller has a vested interest in ensuring you agree to terms with them for the property so that you'll buy their business. And then in doing so and having a deal work that way, you of course then have total control of your footprint. So again, you can do the things you want to do operationally to grow. So just really for me highlighted how important it is to try to do a deal where you seize control of both the business and the real estate that the business operates out of. Some businesses are not as important as it relates to where they operate out of. This type of business was a client-centered, B2C, business to consumer service business, and it had a very unique look, feel, marketing. It had a lot of Google reviews that were associated with a specific address. This particular business, because I know someone in the comments would say, well, why wouldn't you just go to the next place down the street? Well, for one, have you ever moved from one apartment to a house or from one apartment to another? Add 5 to 10 times more complexity for moving a business than moving personally. And then you have to make sure that Google's going to get along with it and switch all those reviews that you acquired at the one location to another location. So much more going on than just moving. So this was a scenario though for these sellers. I mean, imagine being these sellers. They literally had the deal inked as far as the contract. Everything was ready to go. And yet plug gets pulled because landlords just refuse to negotiate. Pretty crazy. The only way that the buyer had a play here is if the seller and the buyer were able to totally unify in the current business owner, AKA the seller, would be willing to go to the landlord and say, listen, if you don't give this buyer the terms that are reasonable, I can promise you that we will not renew our lease when our time comes. So take this deal with our new-come buyer, where I promise you, you're going to have a vacant unit. And this was a property wherein it's not like there's multiple tenants within the property. It's a location with one tenant. So you're either at 100% occupancy or 0% occupancy. The sellers didn't have, in my opinion, quite the chutzpah or the backbone to really pull that off. And that was unfortunate, but it was what it was. I advised everyone in the transaction to do that if they were capable of doing that. But I think when push comes to shove, they just felt like that was something they weren't prepared to do, which is, of course, unfortunate. But at the same time, it just goes to show, especially, and this wasn't my transaction, right? Had this been my transaction, I might have pushed things, further. I'm focused on my own operation. But even still, if it were my deal, at some point, what can you do? You can't make people do things, right? So if you're dealing with a counterpart that just doesn't get it or doesn't have the chutzpah or is nervous about having that kind of a statement or making that kind of a statement to the landlord and holding the line and sending that ultimatum, and you have to think from their side too, okay, well, what if they say that ultimatum, the landlord plays the power play, and then next thing you know, they refuse to renew their lease to the current operators? What happens to their business? So just goes to show how vulnerable you can be when you don't control the land from which you're operating on, in the property from which you're operating in. We explored that before we actually bought B&B, when we were flirting around with a different deal a little bit north of Orlando, Florida. The thing I found is often sellers are less likely to commit to a future valuation than they are to commit to a present valuation. It's basically asking the seller to put on and to ascertain what the future value, bingo, they don't like uncertainty. So you're basically trying to get them to commit to something that they can't see, touch, feel, or understand. And in their rightful defense, what's going to happen with regards to inflation? What's going to happen with regards to GDP or the economy? How much new building is going to take place? What's it going to be cost per square foot? I mean, we can talk about this in a minute. I know we were thinking about getting into inflation a little bit. Building costs have gone up somewhere between 25 to 75% for materials year over year. So what does that do to the cost of replacement? And then, of course, by definition, the cost of real estate and the value of real estate. Owning real estate in October of 2021 is a much more zesty proposition than it was in October of 2019. If you look at things simply from a cost of replacement perspective, the cost per square foot to build is way higher than it was. So for those types of reasons, as well as I'm sure others that I'm not touching on, I've found that sellers are less likely to do that. Of course, unless if the option in 3 to 5 years is enticing enough to get them to take that bet, or if they're just motivated enough. A motivated seller will always surprise you, a truly motivated seller. So I like the idea. I certainly am not against the strategy of an option to buy in the future. The lawyer that I work with, Chris, he's bullish on options whenever you can negotiate them. I've just found in practicality and in reality, it's tough to get sellers to agree to that. Usually it's sell it now for this price, rent it now for this price, or screw you, I'm not interested in any price for whatever reason, a la the deal we talked about prior, where the landlord just refused to negotiate, basically. I will say, to the point of buying real estate, the simplest strategy, if you want to call it that we and I have found for acquiring real estate that you're going to use to operate your business with is undoubtedly the SBA 504. And the nice thing about the SBA 504, for one, the terms are quite interesting. 25-year AM, fully amortized, something like a 3 to 4% interest rate. And I don't believe there's prepayment penalties and I think it's a fixed rate. Don't quote me on the nitty gritty of the terms, because I haven't negotiated a 504 deal in over a year. And sometimes the SBA changes their terms. So I'm not here to be a walking dictionary of the precise nuance of the SBA 504. But big picture, what I can tell you is, for one, the SBA 504 program has a much larger limit than does the SBA 7A. The SBA 7A is the all-purpose SBA vehicle. The 504 is specific to real estate. And it may have a few other uses, but it's really a real estate-based program. And I believe the limit on your SBA 504 cap, don't quote me on it, but I believe it's 20 million. It's at least 10 million. Whereas the SBA 7A is 5 million. Right? So I, Jason Rogers, only have $5 million worth of SBA dry powder that I can access at any time. That's the most. Now, of course, I could refinance the SBA off to commercial and then regain my 5 million in SBA 7A dry powder. The SBA 504 is at 10 or 20 million in dry powder that you have. It's a totally different bucket, and the terms are pretty damn good for it. This is how we acquired the property in Clearwater that we operate, B&B Professional Plumbing and Air, which really has 3 businesses operating out of it, B&B, Patterson, and KB. We have that property through the SBA 504 program. And the nice thing as well about the SBA 504 program is that because it has that government-backed guarantee, lenders can be very aggressive with it. You have an SBA government-based guarantee, and then you have the hard collateral of the real estate. So those in and of themselves are each very credible sources of collateral. You have the United States government on one hand, and you have hard property, a hard asset and land as another form of collateral. So between the two, it's just extremely feasible and possible to do real estate-based deals for your business acquisitions through the SBA 504. You want to get hooked up with a lender that knows how to work the 504 program. Just because a lender says they do SBA loans doesn't necessarily mean they're great at working either the 7A or the 504 or either of those programs. So make sure you get hooked up with a reputable lender for whatever kind of SBA financing. If you do SBA financing, get hooked up with the right lender. But if you do get hooked up with the right lender, you can really go far. So that would be how I'd recommend financing property to go alongside your business acquisition, and do it at the same time, if possible, insofar as making it easier for you to then finance the business acquisition itself. When I bought B&B, before it was plumbing and air, back when it was just plumbing, it was a side. I mean, it was by far the biggest acquisition I'd ever led, about twice as big as the one I'd made prior. And the business itself didn't have much collateral because it's a service-based business, right? There's trucks and there's equipment and there's some copper and PVC pipe, but beyond that, some computers, some desks, that's really not all that valuable in the context of the loan amount. So the way we were able to get that deal done, really on my back alone, a guy who had no net worth to speak of when making that acquisition, other than the highly levered Nebraska property, the way we got that deal done was by blending the 7A and the 504. The 504 was used to finance the property, in Clearwater. The 7A was used to finance the business acquisition. The lender, we worked with a shrewd SBA lender. They do a blended note and use the collateral from the real estate to help sustain and validate the business acquisition. And by blending those two loans together, you get a blended amortization schedule. I think we're on a 17 or an 18-year AM. I believe it's a 17-year combined AM when you combine the 7A loan and the 504 loan. So you get this blended AM that basically lowers your payment and extends out the repayment period. The interest rate comes down a bit because you take that lower interest 504 money, and again, it just helps you get the damn deal done. So that would be my recommendation as far as working the property into the business acquisition and doing it all at once.